Marx and Engels also assume that this dictatorship of the proletariat, which involves absurd centralization, the overwhelming probability of corruption, and impossible computation, as the proletariat now try to rationally compute the manner in which an entire market economy could run, which cannot be done because it's far too complicated for anybody to think through. The next theory is that somehow the proletariat dictatorship would become magically hyperproductive. And there's actually no theory at all about how that's going to happen. And so I had to infer the theory, and the theory seems to be that once you eradicate the bourgeoisie, because they're evil, and you get rid of their private property, and you eradicate the profit motive, then all of a sudden, magically, the small percentage of the proletariat who now run the society determine how they can make their productive enterprises productive enough so they become hyperproductive. Now, and they need to become hyperproductive for the last error to be logically coherent in relationship to the Marxist theory, which is that at some point the proletariat, the dictatorship of the proletariat, will become so hyperproductive that there'll be enough material goods for everyone across all dimensions. And when that happens, then what people will do is spontaneously engage in meaningful creative labor, which is what they had been alienated from in the capitalist horror show, and the utopia will be magically ushered in. But there's no indication about how that hyperproductivity is going to come about, and there's also no understanding that, well, that isn't the utopia that is going to suit everyone, because there are great differences between people. And some people are going to find what they want in love, and some are going to find it in social being, and some are going to find it in conflict and competition, and some are going to find it in creativity, as Marx pointed out. But the notion that will necessarily be the end goal for the utopian state is preposterous. And then there's the Dostoevskian observation too, which is one not to be taken lightly, which is, well, what sort of shallow conception of people do you have that makes you think that if you gave people enough bread and cake, in the Dostoevskian terms, and nothing to do with except to busy themselves with the continuity of the species, that they would also all of a sudden become peaceful and heavenly? Dostoevsky's idea was that, we were built for trouble. And if we were ever handed everything we needed on a silver platter, the first thing we would do is engage in some form of creative destruction, just so something unexpected could happen, just so we could have the adventure of our lives. And I think there's something to be said for that. One of the strangest parts of the Communist Manifesto is that Marx admits, and Engels admit repeatedly in the Communist Manifesto, that there has never been a system of production in the history of the world that was as effective at producing material commodities in excess than capitalism. Like that's extensively documented in the Communist Manifesto. And so if your proposition is, look, we got to get as much material security for everyone as possible, as fast as we can, and capitalism already seems to be doing that at a rate that's unparalleled in human history, wouldn't the logical thing be just to let the damn system play itself out? I mean, unless you're assuming that the evil capitalists are just going to take all of the flat screen televisions and put them in one big room and not let anyone else have one. The logical assumption is that, well, you're already on a road that's supposed to produce the proper material productivity. And so, well, that's 10 reasons, as far as I can tell. And so what I saw in that the Communist Manifesto is like seriously flawed in virtually every way it could possibly be flawed, and also all in evidence that Marx was the kind of narcissistic thinker who could think. He was a very intelligent person, and so was Engels. But what he thought, when he thought, was that what he thought was correct. And he never went the second stage, which is, well, wait a second. How could all of this go terribly wrong? And if you're a thinker, especially a sociological thinker, especially a thinker on the broad scale, a social scientist, for example, one of your moral obligations is to think, you know, you might be wrong about one of your fundamental axioms, or 2 or 3 or 10, and as a consequence, you have the moral obligation to walk through the damn system and think, well, what if I'm completely wrong here and things invert and go exactly the wrong way? And like, I just can't understand how anybody could come up with an idea like the dictatorship of the proletariat, especially after advocating its implementation with violent means, which is a direct part of the Communist Manifesto, and actually think, if they were thinking, if they knew anything about human beings and the proclivity for malevolence that's part and parcel of the individual human being, that could do anything but lead to a special form of hell, which is precisely what did happen. And so I'm going to close, because Marx also thought that what would happen inevitably as a consequence of capitalism is the rich would get richer and the poor would get poorer. So there would be inequality. The first thing I'd like to say is, we do not know how to set up a human system of economics without inequality. No one has ever managed it, including the communists. And the form of inequality changed, and it's not obvious by any stretch of imagination that the free market economies of the West have more inequality than the less free economies in the rest of the world. And the one thing you can say about capitalism is that although it produces inequality, which it absolutely does, it also produces wealth, and all the other systems don't. They just produce inequality. Free market stats, okay? From 1800 to 2017, income growth adjusted for inflation grew by 40 times for production workers and 16 times for unskilled labor. Well, GDP rose by a factor of about 0.5 from 1 AD to 1800. So from 1 AD to 1800 AD, it was like nothing, flat. And then all of a sudden, in the last 217 years, there's been this unbelievably upward movement of wealth. And it doesn't only characterize the tiny percentage of people at the top who, admittedly, do have most of the wealth. The question is, not only, though, what's the inequality, the question is, well, what's happening to the absolutely poor at the bottom? And the answer to that is, they're getting richer faster now than they ever have in the history of the world. And we're eradicating poverty in countries that have adopted moderate free market policies at a rate that's unparalleled. So here's an example. One of the UN millennial goals was to reduce the rate of absolute poverty in the world by 50% between 2000 and 2015. And they defined that as $1.90 a day. Pretty low, you know, but you have to start somewhere. We hit that at 2012. 3 years ahead of schedule. And you might be cynical about that and say, well, it's kind of an arbitrary number, but the curves are exactly the same at $3.80 a day and $7.60 a day. Not as many people have hit that, but the rate of increase towards that is the same. The bloody UN thinks that we'll be out of poverty defined by $1.90 a day by the year 2030. It's unparalleled. And so the rich may be getting richer, but the poor are getting richer too. And that's not the... Look, I'll leave it at that because I'm out of time. But I'll leave it with this. The poor are not getting poorer under capitalism. The poor are getting richer under capitalism by a large margin. And I'll leave you with one statistic, which is that now in Africa, the child mortality rate in Africa now is the same as the child mortality rate was in Europe in 1952. And so that's happened within the span of one lifetime. And so if you're for the poor, if you're actually concerned that the poorest people in the world rise above their starvation levels, then all the evidence suggests that the best way to do that is to implement something approximating a free market economy. And so, thank you very much.
First, a brief introductory remark. I cannot but notice the irony of how Peterson and I, the participants in this duel of the century, are both marginalized by the official academic community. I'm supposed to defend here the left liberal line against neoconservatives. Really? Most of the attacks on me are now precisely from left liberals. Just remember the outcry against my critique of LGBT plus ideology. And I'm sure that if the leading figures in this field were to be asked if I am fit to stand for them, they would turn in their graves even if they are still alive. When I was younger, to give you a critical example, there was in Germany an obsession with Waldsterben, the dying of forests, with predictions that in a couple of decades, Europe will be without forests. But according to recent estimates, there are now more forest areas in Europe than 100 years or 50 years ago. But there is nonetheless, I claim, the prospect of a catastrophe here. Scientific data seem to me at least abundant enough. And we should act in a large-scale collective way. And I also think, this may be critical to some of you, there is a problem with capitalism here for the simple reason that its managers, not because of their evil nature, but that's the logic of capitalism, care to expand self-reproduction, and environmental consequences are simply not part of the game. This is, again, not a moral reproach. And incidentally, so that you will not think that I don't know what I'm talking about, in communist countries, those in power were obsessed with expanded reproduction and were not under public control, so the situation was even worse. So how to act? First, by admitting we are in a deep mess. There is no simple democratic solution here. The idea that people themselves should decide what to do about ecology sounds deep, but it begs an important question, even if their comprehension is not distorted by corporate interests. What qualifies them to pass a judgment in such a delicate matter? Plus, the radical measures advocated by some ecologists can themselves trigger new catastrophes. Let me mention just the idea which is floating around of solar radiation management. The continuous massive dispersal of aerosols into our atmosphere to reflect and absorb sunlight and thus cool the planet. Can we even imagine how the fragile balance of our Earth function and in what unpredictable ways geoengineering can disturb it? In such times of urgency, when we know we have to act but don't know how to act, thinking is needed. Maybe we should turn around a little bit. Marx's famous Thesis 11. In our new century, we should say that maybe in the last century, we tried all too fast to change the world. The time has come to step back and interpret it. The second threat, the commons of internal nature. With new biogenetic technologies, the creation of a new man, in the literal sense of changing human nature, becomes a realist prospect. I mean primarily so-called popularly neural link, the direct link between our brain and digital machines, and then brains among themselves. This, I think, is the true game changer. The digitalization of our brain opens up unheard of new possibilities of control. Directly sharing your experience with your beloved may appear attractive, but what about sharing them with an agency without you even knowing it? Finally, the common space of humanity itself. We live in one and the same world, which is more and more interconnected, but nonetheless deeply divided. So how to react to this? The first and sadly predominant reaction is the one of protective self-enclosure. The world out there is in a mess. Let's protect ourselves by all kinds of walls. It seems that our countries are run relatively well, but is the mess the so-called rogue countries find themselves in not connected to how we interact with them? Take what is perhaps the ultimate rogue state, Congo. Warlords who rule provinces there are always dealing with Western companies, selling them minerals. Where would our computers be without coltan from Congo? And what about foreign interventions in Iraq and Syria, or by our proxies like Saudi Arabia in Yemen? Here, refugees are created. A new world order is emerging, a world of... Can I just finish the page? 2 minutes, literally. A world of peaceful coexistence of civilizations, but in what way does it function? forced marriages and homophobia are okay, just that they are limited to another country, which is otherwise fully included into the world market. This is how refugees, again, are created. The second reaction is global capitalism with the human face. Think about socially responsible corporate figures like Bill Gates or George Soros. They passionately support LGBT, they advocate charities, and so on. But even in its extreme form, opening up our borders to the refugees, treating them like one of us, they only provide what in medicine is called a symptomatic treatment. The solution is not for the rich Western countries to receive all immigrants, but somehow to try to change the situation which creates massive waves of immigration. And we are complicit in this. Is such a change a utopia? No. The true utopia is that we can survive without such a change. So here I think, I know it's provocative to call this a plea for communism. I do it a little bit to provoke things. But what is needed is nonetheless in all these spheres, I claim, ecology, digital control, unity of the world, capitalist market, which does great things, I admit it, has to be somehow limited, regulated, and so on. Before you say it's a utopia, I will tell you, but just think about in what way global market already functions today. I always thought that neoliberalism is a fake term. If you look closely, you will see that state plays today more important role than ever precisely in the richest capitalist economies. So, you know, the market is already limited, but not in the right way, to put it naively. So, a pessimist conclusion. What will happen? In spite of protests here and there, we will probably continue to slide towards some kind of apocalypse, awaiting large catastrophes to awaken us. So I don't accept any cheap optimism. When somebody tries to convince me that in spite of all the problems, there is a light at the end of the tunnel, my instant reply is yes, and it's probably another train coming towards us. Thank you very much.